that's the Nelson Mandelas of the world. Suchiwa, she's my current hero, the Burma lady, right? Give up her life for her country. I want democracy, I don't care the consequences to my own life. Isn't that amazing? And so on.
But we all are. When you go home, instead of keep working, you are.
Yeah. In fact, a lot of us are partial. You know, it's like everything, right? It's a scale. How rational food are you willing to be? Like how far do you go? You know, you can put a scale 0 to 7, and you can place each of us. It's like choosing to be a professor when you can make millions in some other sector, right? Because you just love to be in a place like this.
Because our drivers are not only money.
They're not only money, yeah. We have a larger pool. Yeah. So rational food, the concept, you can check it. I'm not saying is the only let's see, how do I do this? Is the only Indian who has a Nobel Prize in economics. And I think is the only developing country person that I know. Right? You agree? And he dabbles into this kind of thing. He's able to move away from the rational economic model and bring his Indian experience into it, and that is taking him to places. It's amazing.
But if you look at this debate versus fisheries, in fisheries, you are always focused on managing output without any control on the input. I mean, you keep talking about cost, but that's input to getting the output. So here we are burning energy, taking it out of the ground, but we are going after renewable energy. You go back to Herman Daly's argument that if there is a renewable resource, the rate of use should be slower than the rate of renewal. The fisheries, that's essentially the game you're playing. So is there a global rationality missing in looking at it that way?
In terms of fish.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know the minimum rate.
Of fish. Yeah, but you, as a scientist, they will tell you that. They have estimates. Remember, you cannot say you don't know. Okay? You make expectations, you make so actually, William Chang, my partner in many of my papers is the ecology. We have actually what we call the growth rates of every species of fish in the world. Some of them empirically determined, some of them just models, some of them data, but we have the number of each species. Because we don't allow blanks in our data sets, right? If we don't know, we make the best estimate, and we tell you it's an estimate. So they do have, and if we could go by those, then technically you can always take below the growth rate, and that will keep you safe.
Yeah, but I think scientifically also it's not enough going into understanding the inputs that determine the output.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, that is the human side, right? The economic and the social. That's true. We need more work there. How are you doing?
One more question.
Yes.
I was thinking that maybe this is not very good to use the protocol, Kyoto Protocol, because we have already signed the Kyoto Protocol. So the situation by now is that some countries, I mean, the equilibrium maybe is different because it's the condition is that the optimization for this is that the country have already signed the protocol will not lose more if we continue doing this. And the countries that they haven't signed the protocol, that they cannot benefit anymore if they don't sign this. So I don't know that you know that there are some little dynamics in this.
Yeah, this is a static picture. This is a static picture.
So I never see in game theories if there's a time scale for the change in order.
Oh, there are. I can give you papers actually. I can give you that you can follow if you are interested. Or there are dynamic games, big time, yeah. So you can dynamize this. You can make it dynamic. It's just easier for a lecture to have a static model, at least for the first time. Yes, you can. And your point about many countries have signed Kyoto, but they are not following it. Canada is one of them. Decided that the emissions are always going because the country cannot deal with the oil sands or the tar sands. Benefits are too enticing, right? So you keep doing it. So you can sign and do nothing with it. And if you have enough big countries like US and Russia saying no, usually don't go far. But China.
In evolutionary game theory, you can include that the evolutionary behavior of human beings is
first of all staying here. My God. Where do we go? Okay, so let's see. So I did mention to be for country A, it will be really important for them to try to move country B because the cost of them is high, right? So these are some of the things in the literature that you can use. You can use moral suasion. You can just shade the countries, shade country B, such an extent that it's just too uncomfortable not to play. And sometimes it works in the global level. You have situations where, hey, it just doesn't make, I think Japan is getting there slowly with whales, right? It's becoming more and more too not nice for Japan to keep doing it. So you might reach a threshold where the country said, look, enough is enough. This is making us look too bad, so we stop it. So more solution. And allow country B to adapt different targets. Kyoto has done that, developing countries, because of your condition, will give you different targets, just to get the movement. Other financial incentives can be used, side payments, right? I think they're doing that with climate change. Okay, we put $100 billion for developing countries to help them adapt and reduce emissions. So, try to introduce sanctions. Sometimes it comes to a point you say, you either do it or we come after you. And that can be used. You try technology transfers. Okay, we found a secret. Here it is, use it and reduce your cost so we can get movement. So, ways you can get. And these are all applicable to fisheries, to shed stocks. I don't know how much more you want to do. There's so much stuff.
Even if there's another lecture.
Yeah, so I think we should stop here, really, right? Just opening a whole new area for those of you who are interested. Thank you for that attention.
So that is going to talk now about putting humans into models.
So you've heard from Rashid just then a lot of how you can put sort of firms or groups of people or even individuals into how they interact. Yeah, so there's I think it's actually chords over here called in the
Don't move.
that's impossible. The master to do it, right? I shouldn't have expected any less because every morning when I walk out of my front door, my husband goes, "Are your buttons in the right place? Have you got your balconies? Where's your glasses?" I have gone to work with my shirt inside out. So we've had Rashid tell us about how collective groups or firms can work and how you can have people in cooperation. So for the next half an hour, you're actually going to have a sort of like what's called a whistle-stop tour, very fast shoot through all of the other sectors that have actually been modelled. So some of these will have parts of the model as individual people, some of them will be whole industries all in one go. So basically we've heard most of what you see when people talk about models of human actions have largely been around fisheries. There are other fields that get modelled, but not to the same depth so far, or not to the same degree of literature. So we do have the whole rest of the world to think about though, and humans have had a big impact on that. So basically, whether you're thinking at global scales or regional scales or very small scales, you have to think about where the people fit into it. Even if you decide to leave them out, you have to think about what were the implications of that decision. So as I said on the first day, we've pretty much got models for every part of where humans interact in that big world. It's only over in the sort of the government side of things where we're starting to have to develop models. So that's part of why the prisoner's dilemma and the game theory is kicking off, because it's kind of the first pass of where that's going to work. So this is a schematic of a big model that we developed in Australia. And if you just ask the scientists what should have been in the model, they did all the bit down the bottom half. And if you ask the people what they wanted everything in the top half. So you can see that part of that bias in how the world modelling has developed is because the scientists had different interests to what the people thought about. Okay? There's lots of different methods that have been used to put people in models. And for those of you who are playing with conceptual models, that's literally one that we did on a piece of paper in a camping ground about how tourists felt about having their campsites regulated and why they came to locations. Okay, so around megafauna watching up in the middle. So you can use all different kinds of models, from qualitative models to statistical models to just having an impact function or to actually actively playing it all out with a nature-based model. So we think about some of the other sectors. For instance, there's tourism. This is up in northwest of Australia. There are some pretty good understandings of how tourist operations work. Regardless of where you are in the world, if you look over the history of a tourist activity, it goes through this cycle of rejuvenation or decline. It's kind of something no one else has heard about, and it's exciting to go there, and then the word leaks out and more people go. And then the kind of people who are going shift. They're no longer the thrill seekers, they kind of become the mass market of mums and dads or party goers. And so it starts to become stable or decline, and it'll actually pitch off the other end unless they manage to reinvent themselves somehow. So it's not this, it's like thinking of multiple resources. They deplete one fish stock effectively, they deplete one tourist stock, then they have to try and see if they can do another. So it's sequential depletion of tourist resources rather than fish stocks. And sometimes it is fish stocks, so yeah, it's the same kind of concept. There's also, they know the pluses and minuses of what drives tourism. Local markets, regional markets. This is how the marketing guys make their dollar. They target the weak spots and make us want to go there. Okay, so we do understand those kind of things. You can actually also play out agents. So we have a vastly complicated model that looks really boring because it's a number going down the screen. So to try and summarise that for you, basically on the west coast of Australia, there's a place called Exmouth that used to be a US military base. You had to use US dollars and everything. And when the US left, they basically thought the town would die, but it reinvented itself as a tourist centre. So the tourists come in, they go down the coast to a bay that literally has, if I'm standing, there's a really shallow beach. You can teach kids to swim there really well because the water's about this deep. When you get about 4 steps away from the beach, this is the coral reef. So the kids learn to swim with the fish around them, which is a huge incentive. It also means lots of people want to go there. So what happens is they go and they go back and say how great it was terrific. So more people come, they get more dollars, and everybody's happy. You've got jobs, you've got money, that's terrific. Except more people come and you get less dollars because now it's not as crap good. So your animals have changed, the environment's not as good, different kinds of people come that don't want to pay as much. The other thing is that the employers can't get enough people because the oil and gas industry is paying 10 times as much. So you're not going to be a policeman or a boat operator if you're going to get paid 100,000 euros for driving a bus to the oil and gas rig every day. The other problem is that the residents can't find houses because all the tourists are hiring them to stay in for their holidays. And the captains can't keep anyone happy. So if they're on the operating boat, yes, they're getting some money. But the number of times I've been on a boat and I hear someone like a German tourist whinge because they only saw 4 whale sharks instead of 10. So the captains aren't very happy either. They get quite frustrated. So the typical, and the other thing that happens is some of the tourists come on and say, actually, I didn't like that, so they go somewhere else. So they spread the effect up and along the coastline. So you again get that sequential decay through the system. So the typical, what I haven't drawn in there is what typical response is that of a big government like Australia is, I'll fix it with technology. We'll actually put in a sewage treatment plant so that it won't have as many effect with the tourists. Doesn't really work actually. You kind of marginally correct the effect, but the only real effect is to reduce that pressure, which to an Australian, which thinks everybody should have the right to go to the beach, is quite a horrifying idea. You cap the number of people that are allowed to go to a beach. So it's about thinking up smart ways of doing it. You just don't build as many beds, you don't allow as many campsites. So it's about thinking about incentives so people don't feel like they're being cheated, but there's still a value to the resort. The next big sector that gets a lot of attention is the oil and gas sector. So if you think about how many oil and gas rigs are involved, this is just an example. That black area in there isn't the oil spill, it's just actually the number of dots of oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. There's 7,000 oil platforms, of which 400 are active at any one point in time. So they really are, they're almost like a navigational hazard these days. They are a beautiful artificial habitat for animals that want to grow up the sides. And what the oil industry does is it models its production cycle, so it can see if it's going to be competitive, where the wage problems are, how many workers there are. Interestingly enough, it was only in the last 5 years that this oil reserve that they have at the bottom that they're sucking out of, they decided to make it limited. In the past, that was an unlimited resource that they were modeling. It sounds a little bit odd to an ecologist, but it was working fine because the pool was so big to what they could suck out, it wasn't a problem. But now they've got to the point where as much as they can get out is kind of what's there, then they have to worry about those interactions. Okay, next one is the transport sector. So these are all the air networks, shipping routes, roads, and big cities in the world. So you've got pretty blanket coverage there. So there's a few different things that they have to model in that instance. It's actually just the load, so how often do they have to replace stuff? It costs quite a lot of money to replace a road, for instance, so they have to think about that cycle of replacement. There's also what's actually flowing in and out, so they can keep track of economics for reporting and making sure everything's profitable. But there's also the problem of collisions and how you manage that. So there's quite a lot of traffic going in and out. So if you're sitting off the northwest of Australia, there'll be 20 boats lined up ready to come in offshore because they don't have enough entry points. But the port has purposely not put more entry points because there'd just be more boats. It's one of those things where they're actually controlling the amount of boats coming in by saying, you can't come, it's just too limited. Whereas they know if they doubled it, they just double the number of boats that were sitting offshore waiting to come in. You can also look at alternative management strategies that way. So if there's a risk of a collision, so what was the problem up on the northwest shelf was there was only one single way of getting in and out of the reef. Because Australia's two biggest ports both sit on coral reefs. So 25% of Australia's exports go out of a port on the Great Barrier Reef, and another 25% goes out of the port on the reefs on the western coast of Australia. So a lot of times they have very limited channels to come in and out of, which massively increases the risk of a collision and a catastrophic oil spill as a result, because these big boats are carrying oil. Okay? So one of the options was, what happens if they just literally dug another channel? So that's going to make the environmental groups really cranky locally. You've just literally blown up a reef to make another channel to let the boats go in and out. So that sounds bad. The dredging and the plume that makes around the port, that sounds bad. But it massively reduces your risk of a catastrophic oil spill. So that's good. So how do you actually trade off those tensions? The short-term environmental local cost versus that enormous cost that could stretch for 150 kilometres down the coast of Western Australia. The other part is the changed access. So one of the reasons that the coral reef in Western Australia doesn't get as many visitors as on the east coast of Australia, so there's 200,000 people that go to Ningaloo Reef and 1.2 million people that go to the Great Barrier Reef every year. So the Great Barrier Reef is like a very impressive place that you get to hear about this afternoon because we're going to play a game with it. But one of the biggest reasons that they don't go to Ningaloo is it's just hard to get there. So recently it's actually been interesting to watch because the biggest commercial airline in Australia used to be a regulated industry. They weren't allowed to go to Ningaloo. It was just one small company that was allowed in. They deregulated the industry, and now you can get $99 fares to Ningaloo. It used to be $900. So it's massively changed the kinds of people and how many people are flowing into that system. Okay, so thinking on to other sectors that we might not be as familiar with, it's harder to dig up models for. So this is a map of North America. I don't know whether you can see it or not, but there's a little smudge there. So if you think about the Great Wall of China, which is supposed to be the only man-made object you can see from space, you actually have to use infrared, and you can see this little jagged line. That little white smudge is actually an open-cut tar sand line. So it is now the biggest thing you can actually see from space with your naked eye that's man-made. And it's growing, it's doubling in every 2 years at the present moment. It's just not worth Canada's dollar terms to stop it. Environmentally, it has other issues with it. And so that's why they do strategic assessments around that kind of stuff. What's the land use implications, what's the biodiversity implications, what's the health implications, so that they can trade it off. Places like Australia, that's also been an issue where the plumes from the mines, and particularly the salt mines, so when you mine salt, you end up with a lot of hot, salty, really salty water because it's mineral salts, heavy metals. That just gets flushed out. So the blue area in that underlies the grey one. Without any control, that grey stretch, which is about 300 kilometres long, was the area where that plume would have broken World Health Standards. So that's why they had to start regulating. That's why they use models. So they use biophysical models, but they also put in the regulatory models, including having to put in whether the guy is going to get caught. Who's going to go up there and test it? No one lives there. Is it worth his while to go out to the plant every day and do the measurements? So that you actually have to think about the human incentives to pay attention to the rules. So I can tell you that the only guy who really goes out there every day before this regulation happened was the weatherman. Because I looked at the weather record and you can tell where he went on his 1 week holiday every year for the last 25 years because there was no weather recorded. But everybody else's, you might get one record a week if you're lucky. So they had to bring in the regulation, but think about what were the incentives to make the people actually do it. Okay, so one of the biggest ones that we know of from the climate models, where we're already starting to put people in, is land use. So this is a map of the world's land use in 1700. So pretty much all the green stuff is semi-natural. The blue stuff in the top north of India, it was actually villages. The grey stuff is sort of really remote and uninhabited stuff. And the orange that you can see in Europe and parts of the Middle East was actually where there had been intensive agriculture. So this is the case today. So we have radically changed the land cover of the world, and that has implications for what happens in the climate models. And that's why it's actually included in the latest generation of climate models, because there is such an interaction and feedback. And it's a really good case of having to model at different scales. So they don't just have the gridded habitat, they actually delve down into the processes that are happening inside the habitat. So if you think about here, they can actually follow individual trees in some models. So they think about the cohort of trees and then a patch of trees up to the grid cell. It's also a really good example of the kind of simplifications you can make. So on the left here we have a tree, and on the right we have grass. So it's just thinking about how you can use simple shortcut to represent, those kind of industries. Then you can use a similar kind of shortcut to represent the human interactions in the system. So very simple rules can capture the gross behaviour that are after. Sometimes just the general patterns is all you want. We see this a lot in urban planning now, where they're starting to layer up GIS layers to think about how they plan broad-scale land use, now that it's become quite a contentious issue and land is so valuable. So in places like Alberta, but lots of places around the world, they now play out scenarios of what future land use would be like so that they can check for the risks of biodiversity loss, catastrophic, the risk of infrastructure failure having catastrophic effects with flooding or extreme events, for instance, where they might want to put protected areas. Basically just trying to plan how things go. And they do that in the urban city as well, which I'll get to in a minute. But one area that they put a lot of effort into, so this is now a picture of Europe obviously. I don't know if you can see that there's a white tip there in Spain. That white tip is because it's actually a huge mass of greenhouses. So it's affected the local albedo and is affecting the local climate as a result of having that changed colour at the local level. So again, this is an area where a lot of effort has actually have gone into modelling stuff at the farm. So they have soil, water covered, they have the pasture, they have how the managers, how the farmers actually manage stock rotations. They have models for their stock themselves, their wool production, or their beef production, or whatever else they produce. The farm managers, how he goes through his costs, the effects of weather on all that. But some of the biggest innovations have literally been about innovation, how the farmers actually work in social networks to share information. So that includes their political ideology, for instance. So if Ingrid and I are friends, or think we're friends, and if we think the same way about politics, so if we're both thinking of Australian farmers in the northwest, if we have fairly right-wing, so to put it, thoughts about farming, we're not going to necessarily listen to some of the left-wing guys that are suggesting we switch a bit into tourism or we use slightly different technology. We don't want to listen to those scientists. They fly in, they tell us all this information, they fly away again. They don't have to live here in this desert. But if I see that Ingrid's making money because she's letting tourists camp on her beach, and now she's actually made enough money that she's been able to put up some nice little chalets for them to stay in, I'm going to trust that. I'm going to share this information. How'd you do that? How'd you get that set up? So that's the information sharing innovation. So lots of ways of changing for people's behaviour. It's about thinking where that nudge effect is most useful. So for me to hear that I really need to go on a diet and hear it from the TV or reading a book is fine, but if there's a picture of me on the fridge, every time I go to the fridge, like, yes, maybe I really don't need that ice cream after all. So you think about where your nudge effects are, where you're going to get the most effect. So it's marrying psychology with how people do their behaviour. And that's what they're really starting to do in rangelands management, about teaching, by getting people to participate with them, getting them to understand why they can shift their behaviour and benefit. Then there's sort of more classical stuff in the catchments, but they're building in a lot of these other components we've heard from our industries in the catchment models now, because it can actually affect it. So you heard about, for example, from Raghu the other day, where they had people that were way away from the bay that had to think about how they used the system because of the way that it flowed through catchment. And similar tools to the ones that Raghu showed yesterday, that they have managers and scientists and just everyday people play this game in Queensland where they get to manage a map of Queensland to see if they can make the rivers have better water quality. So they have a report card system basically. Can you do better than the government to get the report card up on those different rivers? And so what's it's done is help the people understand that it's not a very short-term thing, that it's A, very hard to do, B, that it's very costly, and C, they've got to have patience. And at the start there was some nervousness that they'd say, okay, toss the whole report card. But in fact, it's now become incremental increase in your benefit. That's actually been what the people have responded to. So they understood that that river over there might be okay in 2 years, but that river over there was actually going to take 20 or 30 years. And they're a bit more willing to wait now because they can understand it by playing it themselves. Some of the best examples of that kind of stuff is actually happening in Vietnam, where there's some modellers have gone in there to help the Vietnamese government, in fact the Southeast Asian governments, think about when you do things to the Mekong, what's the flow-on effects, both for your local population, what's the effects for the local population moving to already heavily cluttered urban areas as a result, but also the upstream conflict. So if you're China and you cut off all the water down the Mekong, that has potentially destabilising effects politically around you. So it's about having that conversation, so at all different scales, from individual to regional to national, they can think about sharing that resource. So this is different kinds of learning. So for instance, we've got farmers on their paddy fields, they say, can we collaborate over sharing water so that we both, we don't steal from each other effectively. That then involves a discussion with the regional government about what is the water allocation. And so on up the chain so that they can get the different levels of negotiation understood and the flow-on effects. Because if the farms don't work, if they go tits up in Australian farmers because they're on the back of their head, then you get more people, more urban poor, basically. What these models include is also an agent-based way of making decisions that's dependent on the season you're in, what kind of income you've got, what kind of things you can do off the farm, and that then dictates what you do on the farm. So it's a lot of those if-then-else statements coming through that you actually discuss with people. You sit down, that's how you populate these models. You actually sit down with them and find out how they really make decisions. And the interesting thing is you have to do that in a couple of different ways, both in Australia but anywhere in the world. If you're in a public forum like this, and I'd say, how do you make a decision, particularly in front of farmers, they'll give you one answer. But if you go into their home and you ask them, you get a very different answer. So in public, they want to be seen as good businessmen or good leaders. They give you an answer that reflects that. In their home, they're worried about their families and social things and how people are going to cope. And they're not the same answers. So you have to ask people in lots of different ways and lots of different settings to actually get information if you're trying to get information out of people about how people. So we're talking about land use before. Another one of those is urban. So on this particular map, that grey area there is the city of Tokyo, which is the biggest continuous urban area in the world. So you can see that it's a densely urban area. From someone in Australia where when I grew up as a kid, my nearest neighbour lived 5 kilometres away. Okay, I never had to worry about space. We had an outdoor toilet, you just let the door open because no one was ever going to come and disturb you, except maybe a snake. That's it. In Tokyo, when my husband and I were there on our honeymoon, we couldn't understand why you weren't even allowed to eat or drink on the sidewalk. And it was a 45-degree day and it was really hot. And a very elderly Japanese gentleman had bought a drink and he stood to the side and he opened it and his wife turned around and yelled at him. And I'm thinking, that's a bit harsh. The guy looks like he's about to die. It's so hot. And it was because when you hold hands, which is another no-no in Japan, or when you open a drink, it's because you're disturbing the flow of the people around you. There's so many people who have to get to places that if you're creating a blockage, if you think about a river, you're really disturbing all that flow. So they have social rules that make their life easier. And those kind of things can be explored in models as well. There's quite a lot of theory that comes behind how urban areas develop. So the original idea came from the way that European cities basically started as a fortress and grew out. But in reality, that's not what urban cities are like. They're much more like the Hoyt's wedges, where you actually get sort of wedges of a high income or wedges of a poor income. So Tasmania is a pretty good example. You live in Hobart, you live to the south of Hobart, you're probably on an average to higher than average income. If you're in the north of Hobart, you're probably in a very low income. The two, there is a little bit of mixing between them to go to shops or stuff like that, but really they're almost two separate worlds. Even politically, people in the north tend to have more stickers that they hate the idea of a Green Party, whilst the people in the south have stickers on their cars that they vote for the Green Party. Okay, it's a very bipolar area. But that's actually more and more common in cities in the Western world. But again, not even that explains what happens in the developing world. So this is actually an example of an open-air market. But there's a beautiful YouTube of this, but I wasn't sure that it would actually run. It's actually on a railway track. So when the train comes, you see all the shutters go in, people get their produce off. The train goes through, all the shutters come back out, they put their produce back out and keep going. So this is really high density housing. Malaysia. So this is why they're starting to have to invent new models for how places in the developing world actually work. Because in places like India and other places like that, you'll have really, really rich suburbs right next to the suburbs of the people who basically the hired help that come in to help them. So they've grown in a very different manner to what we've seen in other places around the world. You've also got to drop geography in it. You've always got the idea of general patterns, but if you've got a river that sort of runs in one direction, they can really change how those patterns go. There are some large agent-based models though, and this is pretty much how all the big countries, all the big cities in the world are now sort of planned. They run this program like Urban Sim, where they simulate how people, how did they literally have a house-by-house model of the city, and all the different people in it, where those people work, where do they live, their access to infrastructure, how the different zoning plans are, and they play it out so that they can understand zoning, but also so that they can marry it with the sort of live weather forecast that Raghu was talking about, so they can do that emergency planning of what's going to happen when that flood maybe breaks or you have a big storm. So this is now a very aged example, but you can see that these colours are slowly changing. This was a run for a city from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, and the number of jobs, for instance, per area. So they could even understand where some of the unemployment would land, where the jobs would be, where there'd have to be pathways for transport. And you can map pretty much anything. So this is different scenarios of housing on one side, different scenarios of employment on the other. And you can see, depending on the scenarios that they had around where they put their infrastructure, where they put their green space, you could get different shapes to the density of jobs and the density of housing. The other one that they do a lot is a one-to-one model. So in America, for instance, and in Australia, there's literally a one-to-one model of the entire population so that they can understand epidemic spread. So if we take the old epidemic models, the differential equation ones, they didn't work, they didn't always predict well what actually happened in an epidemic. So if we think about when swine flu came to Australia, every single city was supposed to end up in this particular pattern, and that's what they were going to make all their vaccine deliveries based on. Then they got the agent-based model and said Sydney will do something like that classical model, but in Melbourne it will be completely different. The epidemic will explode in 2 weeks. Most of the population will get at least a mild dose. And they couldn't understand why it was going to be so different unless you understood the fact that in Melbourne that there's a really good public transport and they also all love football. So every weekend the whole population of central Melbourne walks to the football and mixes with each other. So there was an enormous exposure that you didn't get in the classical model, and you didn't get in Sydney where they tend to live in more segregated suburbs that have different structures and they don't mix as much. So that's what they're using those kind of models for, and these kind of models have things happening at different scales, from neighbourhood scales to small suburban satellite scales up to the whole of the city scale. They're starting to support these zones that you can see are very intermingled and quite complicated because they're trying to meet so many objectives about how things go. And part of that reflects the fact that they also have to include this lobbying factor. So if you think about what people like, different people have different ideas about what they want to have close to them. So fairly affluent people like to have space and potential, at least in Australia, like to have space and green space and things like that. So this was just the way that the council versus sort of the environment or agency versus some of the newly affluent people would have liked to see areas in a town managed. So you can all you just got to take from that is that the curves are different, so not everyone's going to that big area. And stepping up some scales, you get into the huge kind of economic models that Rashid gave you a little bit of a taster for. But basically these sort of can cover investment and taxes and how the government works. And then when you spin them out, these general equilibrium models out to a national scale, they follow, for instance in Australia, they follow 90 regions and 180 different kinds of sector. So electricity and fishing and forestry and agriculture, blah, 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 the whole list in each sector. They're basically trying to follow the flow of money, well not necessarily money, but the flow of materials and stuff through that system so they can see where demands will be, they'll see where emissions are. Now the place that falls down is that they have to make some simplifying assumptions by saying the population will always look the same, or the emissions and demand from overseas will always look the same. And the step they're taking now as they move into the new integrated models in Australia is they're actually not. They're talking to other models that do the dynamic change, so that you've got people in Sydney have a very different lifestyle and a very different emissions compared to people in the middle of the outback of Australia, so that that's actually being reflected as is change through time. That's starting to happen on the international level scale too, in the truly integrated assessment models. So for instance, in some of the really big models that Australia uses the global model to condition its national model when it's making its decisions. These are the kinds of sectors, the other kinds of regions. So Australia's consciously thinking about what the rest of the world's going to do when it's trying to think about what its economy is going to look like and what its emissions are going to look like. Then you get into global trade models where you start to get more to the game theory end of how different countries are going to react. So a bit of a mix of game theory and agent-based theories, how they're represented. And the area that's shot forward in huge leaps and bounds over the last 10 years has actually been the agent-based modelling of conflict. So what they did when they first went into Afghanistan and Iraq was they employed a whole bunch of modellers to sit down there and figure out how to model insurgents. So they could figure out what were going to be dangerous routes for IEDs, how they were going to deal with the evolution. So if we think about parts of the reasons of why some of the damage was as high as it was because the insurgents were learning very, very quickly. So, you know, they had old rifles. They didn't work. The Hummers are too big. But the bottom of the Hummer isn't, so we invented IED. Okay, they go and put metal plates in there. So we stick the IED to the side of the road posts, so it blows out through the side of the door. They start to happen to make a big metal box. We start to undermine the city streets, so they go into the holes. There was an evolutionary game happening between the military and the insurgents. So they had to think about how to break that game. So this is some of the pressures for some of the parts in how they think an insurgent makes their decisions. So where are the incentives to break that? You know, if you're a Afghani farmer who, after the poppy season, has the option to starve to death or get paid $20 by the Taliban to sit there and watch what the Americans are doing, then you've got to think about where you can target your nudge factors in that to try and break that behaviour, give them incentives to do something else. The other part they've looked at is how that can actually go up through tribes into actual conflict between the different tribal groups, for instance. So that whole area is just getting bigger all the time. Now, one of the questions we often get when we get into these big integrated models is, what if we've done this in the past and we actually tried to manage the future the same way we're talking about it now? So if we'd gone back to the 1970s and tried to have an integrated assessment model, could we have said the way the world works and made better decisions? Because that's what we're claiming of the current groups, right? Well, part of that is based on how you respond to those models. So I don't know how many of you have heard about limits to growth in the Club of Rome. Basically, back in the 70s, there were a group who sat down who tried to do that, to model the world, to give people some ideas about what would be the issues. And fundamentally, they were vilified. The pure economists, not the kind of ecological economists that Rashid is, but the pure economists said, it's all crap. Those feedbacks don't exist. It's a bunch of crap. We will find technology that fixes it. Okay? But it's now been 30 years. So the group got back together and they looked at how the world had actually gone versus their predictions. So they didn't just have one prediction. They'd done the scenarios, and the solid purple in each one of these is what the world's actually done. And they got it right, pretty much. For something that was a pretty simple model, they nailed it in their gross terms. So there's some parts that the next few years will be the teller about whether we keep going or whether that happens to diverge. But if you think of one of the biggest arguments that the economists made was that pollution was so bad that people were already doing things to clean up rivers and to try and remediate. So obviously they were wrong. But if you think of carbon dioxide as a pollutant, they nailed it. They got climate change before it was really on any of the government radars. And they said we had about 2050 to get it right before the global community basically fell off the cliff. And that was why the major economists, or at least part of the economy, was so radically a fight back, because they didn't think that was true. So that's one of the tensions we're still fighting today, because if you go to an open economic forum, or you go to people who have heard something about the limits to growth, like my boss, it was like, well, the limits to growth was completely, everyone showed that was wrong. And in fact, they really didn't show that was wrong. So part of it is about how you educate and communicate that stuff. Okay, so if you just think about the integrated assessment models for now, it's been that sort of email backwards and forwards between the physical guys and the economists, like I spoke about the first day. We're going for much more integrated ones now. We're trying to pull those different sector representations together. And if something's left out, that's fine. You have to simplify your models, but you need to think about whether you should have just had an impact factor or something. Just think about why you're leaving things out. We're not the only people trying to do it. So one of the most popular games in a recreational sense that's been played over the last 20 years is a thing called SimCity. SimCity now has climate change, urban disasters, overpopulation, depletion of resources. And the latest version that comes out, I think, in 2 months' time, actually has game theory behind it. If you're playing online, if Stuart decides to pollute, his city degrades, but it can also wave across and start to affect me, creating tension, so the ability to cooperate. There's actually a whole industry now growing up in the gaming world around games based on climate change. So there's a thing called Fate of the World where you get to play a world leader. And you're all online trying to be world leaders to see if you can find a solution to climate change that doesn't economically bankrupt your city. So it's a way of trying to get public are interested. It's trying a way of engaging with the topic. And the reason it's important is we're crossing at least 14 orders of magnitude in scale in what we're trying to do in an integrated assessment model. But the cumulative impacts, it's required to do that, even though it sounds scary, because of the cumulative impacts effect. So this is a map from a few years ago, where they just tried to map all the different effects on the human oceans, and the redder it was, the higher it was. But pretty much nowhere in the world was now free in a marine sense of an impact of human activity. So that's been a very fast tour, and probably not as engaging as Rashid's about all the other human sectors in there. But it's just to say that, you know, there's been a lot of effort in the game theory and in the fishery side of things. There's sort of just dipping the toes in at the other end, where there isn't a tactical outcome like the urban planning. But it's something we need to do as we bring the people back in. Cool.
No plans for like a marine, a sim-marine or build a...
So actually, Billy tried to work with them, but there's some, so he's talked to them about it to try and marry ecosystem sort of thing as an idea underneath. It's hard for a commercial enterprise to do that though, there's so many IP issues around it. But there is the push to try and do that. Often there's not enough understood, or it's so esoteric, it's harder to... And let's face it, in SimCity, just like Godzilla comes out through the city as a random event. So. But there's hope for that.
Plymouth Marine Lab does have one. Do you think you're right if these models as they get more and more coupled, signs of uncertainty and uncertainty propagation through the system also growing, and it comes from nuclear scientists who do this uncertainty incredibly well because they have to. And it's supposed to kind of input output analysis, they track the input from into each model and output each model going into the next model. And you track the uncertainty through the system.
Also, we've already eaten quite a lot into lunch, so if you could be back here in 45 minutes? Okay, yeah, so come back in an hour, okay? And then we'll just play it by ear for the rest of the afternoon from that. We want to give you a little bit of a couple of other lectures, or one other lecture, a bit of a role play, and give you time to do projects. So,